Hey guys, my name is Toby and welcome back to another very exciting Photoshop tutorial where today we're going to be taking a look at the Curves tool. Now, the Curves tool has a number of cool little tricks up its sleeve, but in a lot of ways it's very similar to the Levels tool. So why would you use this over Levels, and why would you use Levels over this? All those questions and more coming up. So what we want to do first of all is add a Curves adjustment, and as I mentioned last week, you could go up to Image Adjustments, Curves, but this will bake that change in, which is not something you want to do. So my suggestion would be to go to Layer, New Adjustment Layer, and then Curves. And we're just going to hit OK, and we now have a Curves adjustment layer, and this dialog box here has popped open. So basically what this is a line, this diagonal line that runs across here, represents the various tones in your image in relation to this graph and the histogram. Now that probably sounded a little bit complicated, but it actually couldn't be simpler. Pretty much, if you click on this line, you can add a point and you can drag it around, and it's going to make things brighter or darker. So if you drag it up and to the left, as I just have, it's going to make everything brighter. If you drag it down and to the right, it makes everything darker. So why is this different than Levels? Because I know what you're thinking. We did this last week with Levels. We made everything brighter and it looked pretty much the same, right? Well, let me try and show you why it's different. Okay, so what I've gone ahead and done is created a copy of our background image with a Levels adjustment applied to it and a Curves adjustment applied to it. So this is the Levels adjustment, and basically it might not look that different, but if we zoom in here, you can kind of see in these highlight areas that it's all a bit more blown out, and the kind of the tonal changes across sort of this section here are quite they're not very smooth, whereas if we take a look at the Curves adjustment, you can see that actually that's a much nicer transition across all those tones. Equally, if we have a look just over here, you can see with Curves we actually have quite a lot of detail in the water here, and you can see a lot of the cliffside. With Levels, that gets really blown out, and the reason for this is basically that a Levels adjustment, you have to move the white point and the black point in order to change your exposure, and by doing that you're actually crushing the tones of the image into a smaller space, so you tend to get this slightly higher contrast effect in your shadows and highlights. Now with Curves, you can kind of think of this top right corner here and this bottom left corner and the points that they have as being your white and black point. Now the thing is, the white and black point when you use a Curves adjustment don't move. Really what you're doing is you're playing with the midtones, and that in my opinion creates much nicer, more natural and kind of smoother changes in exposure. You don't get this kind of contrasty transition between tones where the image has now got less information to play with, and you get this much smoother effect. If you look at the cliff here, you can kind of see that the exposure is absolutely exactly the same. It's just that the tones have more kind of space to breathe, if you want to think of it like that. And in my opinion, it's just a much more natural way to play with exposure. So going back to our Curves again, Curves have got a few other tricks up their sleeve as well. Now, one of the best things that Curves are good at is creating contrast in your shot. So I know we just said that with Levels you tend to get more contrast when you play around with the exposure, but if you're actually purposefully just trying to add contrast, Curves is still better for it. And let me try and explain why. So what you could do is add a brightness and contrast filter, and a lot of people do this, and it's a very quick and easy way to add contrast. The problem is you don't have any control over where this contrast gets applied. It's just, here, have some contrast. It's a bit like going into a restaurant and ordering a steak and them saying, hello, would you like it rare, medium or well done, and you just say, yes, steak please. You're not giving the finer option of where and how you apply this contrast. So if we take a look at our curve here, actually what we're going to do is we're going to add a second curve adjustment, because you don't want to do everything on one curve. You probably could, but it's better to kind of do it in stages like this. So I'm just going to go ahead and name this one exposure, and we'll call this second one here contrast. So to add contrast, if you think about what contrast is, it's basically the bright parts of the image get made a bit brighter and the dark parts get made darker. So we can do this by adding something called an S-curve. Now this is just a fancy name for creating a slight S shape with your curve, and what we've basically done is make the dark parts of the image darker and the bright parts brighter. Now this, on the face of it, doesn't really look very different than using the brightness and contrast filter. But what we can actually do is change where the points are on our graph. So we can actually change at what point the contrast kind of starts to kick in. So we could have it so it's actually very heavy on the shadows. So you can see that actually more shadow tones are being darkened than highlight tones being brightened. So we're adding contrast, but we're mainly adding contrast to the shadow areas. Equally, we could go the other way and we can make it so it's not very much shadow and we have quite a lot of highlight contrast. So it's changing whereabouts the contrast kind of sits in the image, if you want to think of it that way. And it's a much nicer way to work. Now, the other cool thing we could do is if we just reset this quickly. Let's say that actually, looking at this image, we're quite happy with where the highlights are. We don't really want to affect our highlights, but we want to make our shadows darker. So all this sort of stuff on the mountain and maybe a bit of the water, but we don't want to kind of play with this too much, or the lights. So what we can do is just kind of click and add a point there. And because of the way curves work, I'm actually going to add a second point just to protect our highlights. And the idea is that now we can grab our shadow area, drag this down, and this line here won't move. Now you can see that if we took this off, that second point, it does move. It's kind of like a Bezier curve sort of thing, so it will affect the other bit of the line. But if we had a second point just to kind of lock that in, we can now just start to play with our shadow tones, and our highlights will remain completely unaffected. Obviously, where you position these 2 points will kind of change how many tones are going to be protected, if you like, from our adjustment. But it's a good way of really being able to have fine control over kind of how bright or dark certain bits of your shot are. Now, another cool trick that Curves has, we're going to add another Curves adjustment, is you can actually, if you're not quite sure, oh, I want to change this cliff, but I don't know whereabouts on this graph it is, you can use this little hands tool here. We can click this, and then what you're going to see is that it's going to draw a little white circle onto our graph. So we can actually click and we can drag this up and down on the image itself, so we can change that bit. But let's say, oh, well, we don't want to bring these buildings up, we can bring those back down, and you can really kind of, you know, play around with the tones in your shot, just by clicking on the shot itself, which is quite a powerful thing to be able to do. And you can do some really, you know, end up with some really kind of funky, complicated curves if you want. Now, it is very easy, I will point out, to totally kind of screw up curves, and you can easily, you know, do something that looks like that, and, you know, it's a little bit ghastly, but it's basically just kind of being a bit gentle with it and making sure that you're kind of moving the tones around in the way where they're not going to start to look really freaky. And the final thing that Curves can do, and in my opinion Curves does this much better than Levels, is we can add one more Curves adjustment, and we can actually change the colours in our shot. So at the moment I've really just been talking about changing all the tones and all that sort of thing, but what we can do is we can go to the different colour channels by clicking on RGB just here. So we could, let's say we want to go to the blue channel and we want to add more blue, so all you do is you click and drag up. Now this is kind of one of the areas in Photoshop where you do have to understand a little bit about colour theory, so you need to kind of know your colour wheel. So the opposite of blue is yellow, so if you go, oh, I want to add yellow to it, you actually have to come to the blue one and then drag it down. So if you remove blue, you add yellow. Equally, if you go to green, you can either add more green, or you can actually pull green out and you can add magenta. And the red is basically, you can either add red, or you can kind of, I believe this is adding sort of a cyan to your image. So red, cyan, green, magenta, blue, yellow. But as you can see, if we go back to our RGB curve, you can see we've actually pulled everything down. So this has actually made the image darker. So what you can do is, once you've kind of got your colors balanced the way you like them, you can use the RGB to bring everything up evenly, and we should now just be changing the actual colors in our shot. And that is kind of the final trick that springs to mind with Curves. But hopefully that's been helpful. It's a very flexible tool, and I highly recommend you use it. And I also highly recommend that you never bother with the brightness and contrast filter ever again. But I think that's going to do it, guys. My name is Toby. Thank you very much for watching, and we'll see you next time.